When many people think of the Middle East, they imagine Saudi Arabia sandwiched between Africa and Asia with just miles upon miles of desert. While the kingdom contains vast stretches of desert, one thing that cannot be denied is that it's been a site for shocking discoveries. In this video, we bring you what atheists just discovered in Saudi Arabia that terrifies the whole world. Does the name Mount Sinai ring a bell? For many religious people, the mountain is important. However, the exact location has never been definitely established. But you might be surprised to hear the place some scientists just found evidence to be the location of Mount Sinai, Saudi Arabia. According to the biblical and Quranic narratives, Mount Sinai is the place where God revealed his laws and commandments to Moses and the Israelites. For example, in the book of Exodus, God called Moses to the top of the mountain and gave him the Ten Commandments, which are the core of the moral and religious teachings of Judaism and Christianity. In the Quran, God also spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai and gave him the tablets of the Torah or Torah, which are part of the holy scriptures of Islam. Mount Sinai has a rich history and symbolism for each of these faiths. For Christians, Mount Sinai represents God's grace and mercy as well as his holiness and justice. Christians believe that God gave the law to Moses not only to guide his people, but also to show them their need for a savior. And Christians also believe that Jesus Christ fulfilled the law by living a sinless life and dying on the cross for the sins of humanity. For example, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus taught his followers how to live according to the spirit of the law and not just the letter. Christians view Mount Sinai as a foreshadowing of the heavenly Mount Zion, where God dwells with his people in glory. For Jews, Mount Sinai is the most sacred place on earth where they encountered God in a unique way. Jews believe that God chose them as his special people and gave them the Torah as a gift and a responsibility. Jews also believe that God made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, promising to be their God and asking them to be his faithful servants. For example, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses reminded the Israelites of their covenant with God and urged them to obey his commandments. Jews view Mount Sinai as a symbol of their identity and destiny as God's people. For Muslims, Mount Sinai is one of the places where God revealed his will and wisdom to humanity. Muslims believe that God sent many prophets throughout history to guide people to the right path. Muslims also believe that Moses was one of the greatest prophets and that he received the Torah from God at Mount Sinai. For example, in Islamic texts, God praised Moses for his patience and obedience and instructed him to deliver his message to the Pharaoh and his people. Muslims view Mount Sinai as a sign of God's mercy and guidance for all people. So you can imagine how important Mount Sinai is to many religious people today. However, where exactly is the current location of Mount Sinai? The most commonly accepted location of Mount Sinai today is a granitic peak in the south-central Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, known as Jabal Musa or Mountain of Moses. This is based on traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which regard it as the place where God revealed the Ten Commandments to Moses. In the early Christian era, the area was frequented by hermits, and in 530 CE, the monastery of St. Catherine was built at the northern foot of the mountain. It is probably the world's oldest continually inhabited Christian monastery and has a library of ancient biblical manuscripts. Mount Sinai is a 2,285 meter or 7,497 feet moderately high mountain near the city of St. Catherine in the region known today as the Sinai Peninsula. It is surrounded on all sides by higher peaks in the mountain range of which it is a part. For example, it lies next to Mount Catherine, which at 2,629 meters or 8,625 feet is the highest peak in Egypt. The summit has a mosque that is still used by Muslims and a Greek Orthodox chapel that encloses the rock, which is considered to be the source of the biblical tablets of stone. At the summit also is Moses' cave, where Moses was said to have waited to receive the Ten Commandments. But this is where Saudi Arabia comes in, as multiple sites in the Middle Eastern Kingdom have been vigorously pushed by scientists as the modern-day site of Mount Sinai. However, one of these proposed locations is the most controversial. Now, Charles Becker was an English traveler, geographer, and biblical critic who proposed the volcanic idea of Mount Sinai in 1873. He published a pamphlet titled Mount Sinai, a Volcano, in which he argued that the biblical descriptions of the theophany at Mount Sinai suggested that the mountain was a volcano. He also surmised that the mountain should be located along the route that Moses took on his return to Egypt from Midian in northwest Arabia. Becker visited his surmised Mount Sinai in 1874, but he found that it was not volcanic and withdrew his volcanic theory. However, he still advocated the place as Mount Sinai based on its geographical position and historical associations. He identified it as Jabal al-Nur, a mountain near Mecca that is sacred to Muslims as the place where Muhammad received his first revelation. Becker believed that this mountain was also the original site of the Kaaba, the ancient sanctuary that predated Islam. Becker's suggestion of Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia was not widely accepted by other scholars and explorers who proposed different locations for the biblical mountain in Egypt, Jordan, or Israel. Becker's volcanic idea was also challenged by those who interpreted the biblical texts metaphorically or symbolically rather than literally. Becker died in 1874, shortly after his visit to Jabal al-Nur. Alois Musil and H. Philby were two explorers and scholars who suggested the likely location of Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia in the 20th century. They both identified Mount Sinai with Jabal al-Manifa, a mountain near Wadi al-Harab, about 20 kilometers north of Anjuna. Musil argued that Mount Sinai was located on the eastern side of the Gulf of Aqaba in the territory of Midian, where Moses had lived before returning to Egypt. Musil visited Jabal al-Manifa in 1910 and found it to be a suitable candidate for Mount Sinai based on its geographical position, historical associations, and local traditions. Philby was a British explorer, diplomat, and spy who traveled extensively in Arabia and became a close friend of Ibn Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia. He wrote several books on his journeys and observations, including The Heart of Arabia and Arabian Highlands. In the latter, he described his visit to Jabal al-Manifa in 1952 and confirmed Musil's identification of it as Mount Sinai. He also noted that the mountain had a mosque on its summit and that it was revered by the local Bedouins as a holy place. He compared it with other possible locations for Mount Sinai in Egypt and Jordan and concluded that Jabal al-Manifa was the most convincing one. And then there was Jean Koenig, a French scholar, who suggested the likely location of Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia in 1971. He published an article titled Sinaitic Itineraries in Arabia, in which he argued that the biblical descriptions of Mount Sinai matched the volcanic peak of Hala el-Bedra, also known as Jabal al-Lawz, a mountain near al-Bad about 100 kilometers east of the Gulf of Aqaba. Koenig based his suggestion on several criteria, such as the distance and direction from Egypt, the presence of water sources and vegetation, suitability for camping and grazing, and the geological and topographical features of the mountain. He also compared his proposal with other possible locations for Mount Sinai in Egypt, Jordan, and Israel and found them lacking in some aspects. He claimed that his location was the only mountain that met all the requirements of the biblical narrative. Now, Koenig's suggestion of Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia was influenced by the earlier explorers and scholars who proposed similar ideas, such as Charles Becker, Alois Musil, and H. Philby. However, Koenig was the first to identify Hala el-Bedra as Mount Sinai rather than Jabal al-Manifa or Mount Begia. He also provided more detailed arguments and evidence for his hypothesis than his predecessors. But now here comes the controversial one. Ron Wyatt was an American nurse, anesthetist, and amateur archaeologist who suggested the likely location of Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. He claimed to have discovered the site of Jabal al-Lawz, a mountain near al-Bad about 100 kilometers east of the Gulf of Aqaba, as Mount Sinai, based on his interpretation of the biblical narrative and his observation of various features and artifacts on and around the mountain. He also claimed to have found other biblical sites and relics such as Noah's Ark, Sodom and Gomorrah, the Ark of the Covenant, and the blood of Jesus. Wyatt's suggestion of Jabal al-Lawz as Mount Sinai was based on several arguments such as the distance and direction from Egypt. He believed that the Israelites crossed the Red Sea at the Gulf of Aqaba, which is supported by some ancient sources such as Josephus and Eusebius. He also calculated that Jabal al-Lawz was within 11 days' travel from Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites camped before and after their stay at Mount Sinai. He also based his conclusion on the presence of water sources and vegetation. He claimed that he found a large split rock near Jebel al-Lawz that could be the rock that Moses struck to produce water for the thirsty Israelites. He also claimed that he found almond trees near the mountain which could be related to Aaron's rod that budded almonds. And then there was also the suitability for camping and grazing. He claimed that he found a large plain at the foot of Jebel al-Lawz that could accommodate millions of people and their flocks. He also claimed that he found stone enclosures and pillars that could be the remains of the Israelite camp and altars. He also referenced the geological and topographical features of the mountain. He claimed that he found evidence of fire and smoke on the top of Jebel al-Lawz which could correspond to the divine manifestations on Mount Sinai. He also claimed that he found a cave on the mountain that could be where Moses met with God. And finally, there was the archaeological and historical evidence of the mountain. He claimed that he found inscriptions and petroglyphs near Jebel al-Lawz that could be related to the Israelites or their ancestors. He also claimed that he found Egyptian artifacts and structures near the mountain that could be related to the Exodus or earlier events. However, Wyatt's suggestion of Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia was controversial for several reasons. First, he lacked any formal training or credentials in archaeology, and his methods were unscientific and unsystematic. What's more, he did not conduct any legal or licensed excavations, nor did he publish any peer-reviewed reports or papers on his findings. Second, he faced criticism and opposition from both secular and religious authorities. He was arrested and jailed several times by the Saudi Arabian government for trespassing and smuggling artifacts. Third, he caused confusion and division among his followers and supporters. He founded the Wyatt Archaeological Research War Organization to continue his work after his death, but it split into several factions and ministries that disagreed over the ownership and validity of his discoveries. Meanwhile, there are other shocking discoveries in Saudi Arabia. One of them is that the desert landscape was once an area with a lush vegetation. Surprised? Well, even before jumping into scientific evidence, historical texts attest to this. The Quran is the holy book of Islam that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century CE in Mecca and Medina, two cities in western Saudi Arabia. The Quran contains many verses that describe the natural phenomena and wonders of Allah's creation, such as the sun, moon, stars, mountains, seas, plants, animals, and humans. The Quran also mentions some of the historical events and places that are related to Arabia, and some of the oldest written sources that mention the geography and climate of Arabia are the works of ancient historians, geographers, and travelers such as Herodotus, Pliny, Strabo, Josephus, Eusebius, and others. These authors describe Arabia as a land of mountains, valleys, rivers, lakes, forests, pastures, and spices. They also mention the trade routes that connected Arabia with other regions, such as the incense route that brought frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia to Egypt, the Mediterranean, and Mesopotamia. And then there is also fossil evidence. Fossil records are the preserved remains or impressions of organisms that lived in the past. They provide evidence for the evolution and diversity of life on Earth, as well as the environmental changes that occurred over time. Some of the fossil records that support this claim are fossils of elephants, hippos, and crocodiles. These are large animals that need abundant water and food sources to survive. They also indicate the existence of rivers and lakes that support diverse aquatic fauna and flora. Fossils of these animals have been found near Jebel al-Lawz, the mountain mentioned earlier as a proposed location of Mount Sinai. They have also been found near ancient lake beds across the Arabian Peninsula that were mapped using satellite imagery. These fossils date back to 350,000 years ago or earlier, suggesting that Saudi Arabia had a wetter and greener climate in the past. Scientists have also found fossils of seahorses. These are small fish that live in shallow coastal waters and feed on small crustaceans and plankton. Fossils of seahorses have been found near Al-Waj, a city on the Red Sea coast of Saudi Arabia. They date back to 7,000 years ago or earlier, suggesting that the sea level was higher and that the climate was warmer than today. Fossils of plants have also been found in various parts of Saudi Arabia, such as Taima, Tabuk, Al-Jawf, and Jizan. They include ferns, cycads, palms, grasses, legumes, and other flowering plants. They date back to different geological periods such as the Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Paleogene, Neogene, and Quaternary, suggesting that Saudi Arabia had different types and phases of vegetation in its history. There are also fossils of humans. These are the preserved bones or artifacts of humans and their ancestors that lived in the past. They provide evidence for the origin, evolution, migration, and culture of human populations. They also indicate the interaction and adaptation of humans with their environment and other species. Fossils of humans have been found in several sites in Saudi Arabia, such as Khalil Am-Aishan, Al-Wusta, and Jebel Qatar. They include stone tools, pottery, inscriptions, petroglyphs, structures, and human bones. They date back to different periods of human history, such as the Lower Paleolithic 400,000 years ago, Middle Paleolithic 90,000 years ago, Upper Paleolithic 40,000 years ago, Epi-Paleolithic 20,000 years ago, and the Neolithic 10,000 years ago. And scientists also found geological records that support the Green Saudi Arabia theory. They were able to prove the presence of water bodies and landforms that require a wetter and warmer climate than the current desert conditions. Some of the geological records that support this claim are ancient river channels and lake basins. These are the traces of former watercourses and water bodies that carved and filled the land surface. They indicate the existence of rainfall and surface runoff that supported a hydrological cycle and a freshwater ecosystem. Ancient river channels and lake basins have been identified in various parts of Saudi Arabia, such as Taimar, Tabuk, Al-Jawf, Jizan, and Rub al-Khali. They have been mapped using satellite imagery and field surveys. And these also date back to different geological periods such as the Pleistocene 2.6 million to 11,700 years ago, Pliocene 5.3 to 2.6 million years ago, Miocene 23 to 5.3 million years ago, Oligocene 34 to 23 million years ago, Eocene 56 to 34 million years ago, and Paleocene 66 to 56 million years ago, suggesting once more that Saudi Arabia had a wetter and greener climate in the past. And scientists have also referenced the chemical composition and isotopic ratios of rocks and sediments. These are the characteristics of the minerals and elements that make up the solid materials of the Earth. They indicate the temperature, pressure, humidity, and salinity conditions that influenced their formation and alteration. Chemical composition and isotopic ratios of rocks and sediments have been analyzed in various parts of Saudi Arabia, such as Taimar, Tabuk, Al-Jawf, Jizan, Rub al-Khali, Asir, Najd, Hijaz, Tuwaik, Hasa, and Dhahran. They include carbonates, evaporites, clays, silicates, sulfates, phosphates, iron oxides, organic matter, and others. And they too date back to different geological periods, such as the Quaternary 2.6 million years ago to present, Neogene 23 to 2.6 million years ago, Paleogene 66 to 23 million years ago, Cretaceous 145 to 66 million years ago, Jurassic 201 to 145 million years ago, and Triassic 252 to 201 million years ago, suggesting that Saudi Arabia had different types and phases of climate in its history. What's more, coral reefs and seagrass beds have also been discovered in Saudi Arabia. These are the structures and communities of marine organisms that live in shallow coastal waters and depend on sunlight for photosynthesis. They indicate the presence of clear and warm seawater that provides nutrients and habitat for many marine organisms. Coral reefs and seagrass beds have been found in various parts of Saudi Arabia, such as Al-Waj, Yanbu, Jeddah, Farasan Islands, Jizan Bay, Ras Tanura, Jubail, Daman, Khobar, Qatif, Safwa Bay, Turat Bay, Umlaj Bay, Uba Ali Island, Karan Island, Karayan Island, Jana Island, Jariad Island, and Marjan Island. And you won't be surprised to hear that they too date back to different geological periods, such as the Holocene 11,700 years ago to present and Pleistocene 2.6 million to 11,700 years ago, suggesting once more that Saudi Arabia had a warmer and more stable climate in the past. One of the most shocking discoveries in Saudi Arabia, however, is the existence of hundreds of stone structures that have been dubbed gates by archaeologists. The gates are rectangular platforms enclosed by low walls and connected by long walls that form a courtyard. They range in size from 20 to 620 meters in length and are mostly oriented parallel to lava flows. They are found in clusters in the volcanic fields of Herat Khaibar, north of Medina, and other parts of Saudi Arabia. The gates were first observed in person by a group of amateur archaeologists led by Dr. Abdullah Al-Said in 2004, but they did not appreciate their design or significance at that time. In 2008, they revisited the area using Google Earth and were stunned by the extent and variety of the structures. They sent their photos and coordinates to professional archaeologists such as Dr. David Kennedy for feedback. Dr. Kennedy, an archaeologist at the University of Western Australia, has been studying the stone structures of Arabia for decades using aerial and satellite imagery. He has catalogued nearly 400 gates using Google Earth and published his findings in the journal Arabian Archaeology and Epigraphy. He has also identified other types of stone structures, such as kites, wheels, pendants, keyholes, and triangles that date back to different periods and serve different purposes. The purpose and function of the gates are still unknown, but they may have been used for ritual or social activities related to cattle cults. Dr. Kennedy suggests they may have been built by nomadic tribes who moved across the landscape following the availability of water and pasture. He also suggests they may date back to at least 2,000 years ago and maybe as far back as 9,000 years ago, making them older than Stonehenge or the Egyptian pyramids. The discovery of the gates is significant because it reveals a new aspect of the ancient history and culture of Saudi Arabia and its people. It also challenges the perception of Saudi Arabia as a desert devoid of human impact and shows that it was a dynamic and diverse landscape that hosted various civilizations and empires over time. It also demonstrates the potential and value of using modern technology such as Google Earth to explore and document archaeological sites in remote and inaccessible areas. And yet another shocking discovery in Saudi Arabia is the existence of 4,500-year-old roads with ancient tombs along them. The roads are called funerary avenues by archaeologists. They are disused corridors that link oases and pastures across the desert regions of northwestern Saudi Arabia. They span large distances, sometimes hundreds or thousands of kilometers, and follow the natural topography and water sources of the landscape. They are mostly oriented north-south or east-west. And the tombs are called pendant or ring burials by archaeologists. They are stone structures that flank the funerary avenues on both sides. Pendant burials consist of circular cairns with long tails that extend perpendicular to the avenue. Ring burials consist of circular cairns surrounded by low walls. The tombs vary in size and shape, but they are usually about 2 meters high and up to 20 meters long. They contain human remains and grave goods such as shells, stone tools, and animal bones. The funerary avenues and tombs were discovered by researchers from the University of Western Australia using aerial surveys, ground surveys, excavations, and satellite imagery. They have identified and mapped about 18,000 tombs along the funerary avenues in the counties of Al-Ula and Khaibar. They have also sampled and dated about 80 of the tombs using radiocarbon dating and other methods. The dating show that the funerary avenues and tombs date back to about 4,500 years ago, between 2,600 and 2000 BC. They belong to the Bronze Age period of Arabian history when complex societies and civilizations emerged in the region. They may have been built by nomadic tribes who moved across the landscape following seasonal patterns of rainfall and vegetation. They may have also used the funerary avenues as routes for trade, migration, communication, and ritual activities. The discovery of the funerary avenues and tombs reveals an unknown aspect of the ancient history and culture of Saudi Arabia and its people. It also challenges the perception of Saudi Arabia as a barren and inhospitable land, and shows that it was once a dynamic and diverse landscape that hosted various forms of human settlement and expression over time. It also demonstrates the potential and value of using modern technology such as satellite imagery to explore and document archaeological sites in remote and inaccessible areas.